This is Matt with MS Partners LLC, where we buy and sell vacant land throughout the U.S. And I once again am the land guy, back here to answer any questions that you might have. Today I'm going to answer another question for you, and that is, how do you value your land? Well, let's say that you don't have any realtor buddies. That'd be your obvious answer. Ask a realtor that knows what he or she is doing. And you have access to something called the internet. Okay. What you could do is go on the internet and try to figure out what it's worth, right? A lot of people out there will try to do something called a zestimate on Zillow, where it's going to zestimate your property for you. Most likely, that's just not going to be accurate. Okay. However, you can use Zillow to determine the value of your property, but just not the zestimate. That is most likely going to be off. And sometimes it's going to be off fairly big. It could be up or down. You might be losing money because you use that zestimate, or you could just be way overshooting the market, and then your piece of land is going to sit on the market forever. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you just two simple examples in how to value your land. So let's go ahead and share the screen here. It would help if I had this popped open. Okay, come on. Sorry, here we go. Okay, first one, we'll do an easy example. So you have let me move my face here. So you have the address of the property. Okay, you can go ahead and punch in the address here on Zillow, and that's going to help you find it a bit quicker. If you don't have the address, you can look it up, just kind of well, I taught you how to find your property in the previous videos with the GPS coordinates. So you already know where your property's at. Now you can just kind of look it up either with the address or just zoom into your property and look it up that way. Okay, so in this case, we know where the address is at. Simple way to do it is just to punch it into the search box here. So that's what we're going to do. And you notice once we do this, it's going to give you kind of a zestimate here, right? Again, don't use this. It's most likely it's going to be off. In some areas like this here, we're in Lee County, Florida. It could be pretty close just because there's so much data and so many sold comps that it could be close, but we don't want to rely on that. So let's go ahead and pop out of that. All we have to do here is just zoom in. So it was this property right here. Do not use these gray numbers here. These gray numbers are, man, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what these gray numbers are. Canceled values. It could be at one point they tried to sell them and it was canceled. The most important thing you want to do here is just use sold comps. Okay. You can see a lot of for sale. However, for sale comps are not going to be accurate. Okay. There could be people here basically wishing that their property can sell for X amount. So do not use that. That is a very bad comparison. You want to use sold comps only if possible. If you're in a state like Florida, which is a disclosure state, sold comps are going to be easy to come by. If you're in a different state like New Mexico, where I'm at, sold comps are difficult to come by because we are a non-disclosure state. But I'll show you how to kind of get around that still using Zillow. So what we want to do is we want to try to find properties that are comparable to our property here. This property here is the same size as this one. I should have looked up the acreage, but it's about 10,000 square feet, which is a quarter acre roughly. So we're going to be looking for properties that are about a quarter acre in size. Now, you could try to filter it if you'd like to. Filtering it here, properties between a quarter acre up to whatever, a half acre, an acre. Uh, I usually don't unless there is just an overwhelming amount of comps. If this is just flooded with yellow everywhere, then you probably want to minimize that down. Here you can see we really don't have that many, so I'm not too worried about that. You want to have comps that are no more than 12 months old, generally speaking. If you just don't have any comps in this area, then you have no choice but to go further back in time, right? So we put 24 months, and you'll notice that there are now more yellow sold comps available. But I think we had plenty for now at 12 months. So we'll go ahead and back it off to 12 months. And we're going to go ahead and do some comps, comparisons. Okay. So this property was right here. This is our property. We're trying to figure out what it's worth. Now, when doing comps, comparables, you want to try to find properties that are comparable to your property, right? So we want to find properties like this about the same size. We're not looking at properties like this right here that are sitting alongside the canal or waterfront properties or golf course front properties. Things like this that have specialties that maybe your property does not. Okay. Now, the good thing about this area is it's all flat. So as far as slope goes, we don't have to worry about none of that. Very easy. These are all paved roads. All of them have utilities. You got houses all around. So I'm just going to assume all of the utilities are there. All those important factors are available. Okay. So we got our property here. We're going to look for the closest properties possible. So generally speaking, you want to stay as close to your property as possible. You do not want to venture off very far. If you've got comps all around you here, that's what you're going to want to stick with. If you don't have any comps, then you have to venture out a little bit further. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. So this one says 450,000. This one says 45,000. Well, that's quite a big difference here. This tells me that this is probably a house. Okay, if we click on it, oh, what do you know? There's a house on there. Okay, so obviously we're going to ignore that for a land comp. Now we look at this one here. This one looks like it was the same size square footage wise. Oh, that's what we looked at. But yeah, I mean, we could just basically see that here, that these two are about the same size. Now, I know I should have known kind of how big my property was here on the get-go, but I just kind of punched in a random address to pull this up. I wonder if we could pop that open and it tell us. It's not telling us, but just by looking at it, I can see this one's about a quarter acre. Okay, so this property here is also about a quarter acre. This one sold for $45,000, and that's really close to this property. That's a good comp, right? We can kind of scroll down. You can read some of the descriptions here if you like to, which can help. For example, if you see a description here or a property, same size, and it sold for 75, 80,000, same size, and you have two comps here. This one's also about a quarter acre, 50,000, 45,000. And then you have another one here, maybe it sold for 75,000, but you're going to kind of want to know why. So what I do is I'll click on the description and I'll read it a little bit. Sometimes it'll say certain things like some areas require septic tanks, right? So it might say a septic tank has already been installed, or maybe it has a water meter already on the property. So that does factor into the pricing. But our land here, for example, is just pure vacant land, nothing on it. And looking at these comps around here, we can safely assume by reading the descriptions as well that there's nothing on the property. So just by using these two comps alone, I'm going to safely assume that this property here is worth about $45,000 to $50,000. Now, you can get a little more accurate by kind of finding out when they sold. So this one sold in April 2025. Looks like they built a house on it and then tried to sell the house. And then this one here sold April 2025. So those are two really good comps sold about 4 months ago. That is something I would use for sure. And we can go ahead and check one more. This one is a bit larger than a quarter acre. Still a good comp as far as size goes. It's a little larger, but I wouldn't really fuss too much about that. So generally speaking, you're pricing on a price per acre. Okay. So if your property is 1 acre, the lot next to you is 2 acres, and it sold for $100,000. Well, that's 50,000 per acre. And that would mean that your lot is generally speaking worth about 50,000. So we try to price it per acre. You want to keep the comparable property about the same size as yours. If you don't have one that's the same size as yours, then you have to price it per acre. So if you're lucky, you got a lot of good comps that are about the same size as your property. Okay, so looking at that, this one's about 0.34 acres, a little bigger than a quarter acre, sold for 42,500. This one sold in May of 25, also very good time frame. So we could safely assume that the property values in this area are selling for between $43,000 and $50,000 for a quarter acre. Now, who knows? Maybe this person was just a little more motivated than these two sellers here. They got the offer for 43. Buyer offered a little more and they took it. Okay, so you could sell for possibly up to 50,000 and you can get at least 43,000 in this little neighborhood right here. So I would average it out, say this property is probably worth about $46,000. All right, well, that's an easy one. Let's look at a bit more difficult of a property. I have to move my face and my video's in the way here. All right, so we are looking in, looks like Santa Fe County, New Mexico. This is going to be more rural land. There's going to be less comps, and we are in a non-disclosure state. All right, so for this example, really doesn't matter quite where our property's at here, but we're going to say that we have a 10-acre tract of land, and we'll just say for example, it's located right here. So we have 10 acres located off Entranosa Road. So we got good road access. Generally I would also open up Google Maps, look at it on Street View and stuff just to kind of check it out, but we're not going to do that for this video. But it does look like at least it is a county maintained dirt road. We can see electrical poles right here. If you use Google Maps Street View, you can kind of see a little more. So we're just going to work on some basic comps now. So here's 10 acres, and we're going to try to find properties that are comparable. So this one is 80 acres. Is 80 acres comparable to 10 acres? If it's the only thing you got, you could try to do a price per acre. However, the larger in acreage that you go, the less per acre that it sells for. And there's no exact formula to this, which is why we want to try to find properties as close in acreage as our property. So I'm going to skip this one, even though this is right next to us. We're going to try to find something that's closer in acreage. 5 acres. Now that's a lot closer. Okay, so let's pop this one open. Again, price unknown. We are in a non-disclosure state, so we got to try to work some magic here. One good thing about Zillow is it does show pending. Phone's ringing. It does show pending. Okay. It listed for last listing price was 50,000. It shows it was pending for 50,000, which doesn't necessarily mean that it sold for 50,000. What I like to do for properties like this is if I see it's pending like this, I will subtract 10% to assume the sold price. So 10% of 50,000 is 5,000. So we could assume that it sold for 45,000. 45,000 divided by 5 is about $9,000 per acre. Okay. 5 acres comparing it to 10 acres is relatively close. So I might say that is an equal comparison. So our property is 10 acres, which means that our property based on this comp alone could be worth about 90,000. So we don't want to just use one comp. So this comp's telling us 90,000. Okay, let's keep that in mind. Here's another 6 acres roughly. Now this 6 acres sold for 80,000. That's quite a difference in price per acre. Now I want to try to read a little bit of this right here. I'm not seeing anything special as far as septic tanks, anything like that. This one sold about the same time frame. So that throws off the comps a little bit there. So $90,000 was the last one, 5.92 divided by those 80,000 minus 10%, 8,000, so 72,000. Oops, so we're doing that wrong. So 72,000 is the assumed sold price for this 5.92 acres because it sold for or is pending for 80,000. Subtract the 10%, we got 72,000. We're going to divide that by the 5.92 acres, and that gives us 12,000 per acre. So that is a bit more than our 9,000, right? So between 9 and 12,000 per acre now is what we're seeing. Let's see if we could find something else. 5 acres, 50 acres, 10 acres. Okay. So here's a 10-acre tract that sold April of 2025. It is pending for 135. So the pending price was 135. We're taking off 10% to assume the sold price, which is $121,000, 500 divided by 10 acres. That brings us back to 12,000. So now we have two comps that are telling us about 12,000 per acre. And a third comp told us 9,000. Okay. All are in the same area. Seems like they all got equal type of road access. I'm going to assume there is utilities. We got houses here. We got houses all around here. So whatever utilities are available out there, I'm going to safely assume that those are also right here. Okay, because we have houses right here. We saw there's power lines. So I'm going to say those are pretty good comps. Um, Here's another 10 acre. Hopefully this one doesn't throw us off. Not really. This one's going to be a little cheaper. So 90,000 for 10 acres is 9,000, and I wanted to take off the 90%. So this one is going to be a bit cheaper. 8,100 per acre. So it looks like they're selling between 8,000 to 12,000 per acre. You can average that out and say that it's probably worth about 10,000 per acre. Now, if you have a property that's a little nicer, maybe it's got some extra features. Uh, you have already maybe a little drive path already established on the property. Power lines are really close, easy to draw power. You might be able to ask 11,000, 12,000 per acre. Maybe your property is a bit more rural, uh, and maybe just the access off the road isn't as great. So you might want to ask a little less, 8, 9,000 per acre. These are things to keep in mind. Generally speaking, we'll kind of go with the mid-range here at 10,000 per acre. At 10 acres, we're at $100,000 is your potential value for this property. Okay, so you could list it at 110, kind of leave yourself some negotiation room, list it at maybe 120. You don't want to go too high because then you risk not attracting any buyers. So that's how you use Zillow to evaluate your property and figure out what it's worth. Okay. If you or anyone you know is looking to buy or sell vacant land, please visit our website at usa123land.com and you can submit a property form that way. As always, flip dirt, surf more, live free, and live well, my friends. It's great seeing you. I'll see you for the next video.